George is a professorial research fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health and honorary professor, University of Melbourne. Born in Czechoslovakia, his father Hans Funk was a chemist and his mother Therese was a trained beautician in Vienna. George was born there in 1936 and was 3 years and 10 months when interned at Tatura. George and his wife Anne have 2 children and 7 grandchildren. George.
Thank you very much, Seamus, which is simply a timeline of when we left Vienna in 1939 via Trieste and by way of the SS Conte Rosso, which was plying trade between Europe and Shanghai via Singapore. Next slide shows Vienna in my family around about the 20s when life was a lot happier. To the right is my grandfather, Emanuel Weiss, or Mano as he was called fondly with the family. Next to him, of course, is his wife, Malvina, who had 9 siblings. And then my mother, Teresa, not yet married. And next to her is her brother, Fritz. Fritz was a graduate or a student in philosophy at the University of Vienna, and unfortunately sustained severe brain injuries as a consequence of the 1929 anti-Semitic riots, which occurred in Vienna, in the University of Vienna. Now, going back to Emanuel Weiss, Mano Weiss, he was an entrepreneur, great entrepreneur. He established a major perfumery industry. In fact, it was called Perfumery Weiss. And he attracted with him many of the siblings of my grandmother, Malvina Weiss. They were the Engel family, so it became a Weiss-Engel consortium. Next slide shows some of the documents that relate at least to me. I have to say that after, and a bit like Seamus pointed out, I felt an alien when, even after we'd been released from Tatura. I'm not sure why that was, whether it was mainly because I was speaking German, entirely German at home, whether therefore I had a large German or very distinct German accent, or whether at the same time there was a lot of anti-Semitism at the time, particularly in the area that I worked in, which was, or lived in, the St Kilda State School in Brighton Road. But it wasn't until I actually obtained these documents long after that that I realized that in fact I was an enemy alien. And it always amuses me that at the age of 3 years and 10 months, I was regarded to be a danger to the state or to the country of Australia. The form down below is the discharge form from Tatura. I don't think you'll be able to see it, but in fact it states that my family was released from Tatura in August 1942, and written in red it says, however, released only on parole. So far the parole has not yet been lifted, so I gather I'm the longest parolist, or might be one of the longest parolists as far as I know in Australia. Next slide shows another document, and this relates to my mother and is one that I particularly find, well, to put it mildly, simply ugly, because here was a woman, young woman, who had done absolutely nothing, and she had fingerprints taken. She was treated as a criminal, and this always made me somewhat angry. Now, to switch to something more positive, Eva's father, Karl Duldig, famous as a sculptor and painter, played a major role in the camp in getting people to paint and make and construct different useful tools, etc. Indeed, my grandfather, Emmanuel, who was with us, was very good. We couldn't buy any toys. He was able to make cars for me out of tin toys made from tins of tobacco and so on. But the construction that I value most is in fact a Torah, simply a cigar box which kept the Torah. The Torah is, for those that don't know, the holy scrolls of the law in Judaism. That is to say, it comprises the 5 books of Moses. And next slide shows the actual Torah inside the box. As always, it's covered completely, and there is a breastplate. That's a standard breastplate that my grandfather fashioned out of some tin or other. It's amazing to me. And also a pointer that you can see here, which is also typical of the Torah. Now, of course, my grandfather couldn't possibly fit the 5 books of Moses in such a small space, and he wouldn't have had the time or the ability probably to do so, but he did put quite a few Hebrew words, a few stanzas that were of value in there. And the next slide shows some of those, and of particular importance is the last stanza, which in Hebrew reads, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, which is in English, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And the importance of that is, it is the most important verse in the Torah. It is the fundamental tenet of Judaism. That's to say, the Abrahamic religion, one God only. Quite a few years, we've forgotten about the Torah, or virtually forgotten about the Torah now, and you see my parents in a much better state than they would have been in those days in Tatura. With my father on the right, he was very capable, established his own chemical industry in Australia, cosmetics, and my mother established a complementary retail business in the form of the Paris Perfumery in the Royal Arcade. With respect to my own life, I was very fortunate to meet up with and to persuade to marry me Anne Elizabeth Langson. Here we are enjoying a drink, as is often the case, at one of our favorite places, the American colony in Jerusalem, in fact. And Anne is definitely my most ardent critic and therefore best friend, because she helps me in many different ways. In terms of my own career, my father wanted me to go into chemistry with him, but from the age of about 8 or 9, I was determined to do medicine, and in fact got into medicine at Melbourne University in those days, completed my medical degree, did clinical work, and as a consequence of unexpected award scholarship, I ended up at Oxford, and that catapulted me from being a clinician into a clinician that also did research. And my research is focused on what's called neuroendocrinology, which is the way the brain controls hormones, and hormones control the brain. This I found a particularly satisfying photograph. It's a photograph of my son on the right, Jerome, and grandson on the left, Sharon, his son obviously, and the two of them are tending to a massive headstone. And that headstone is the headstone of the grave of my paternal grandfather, whose name was Solomon Funk. He was the chief rabbi of Vienna, the chief rabbi of Austria, advisor to Kaiser Franz Joseph, and renowned for publishing numerous books on mainly the Talmud, but also on a number of other issues. He was an absolutely stalwart Zionist. And in 1921, he wrote a book that was quite influential. Come from Zion, the fight for Zion, and I'm sure he would have been very pleased to meet these two chaps who've played their role in Israel's defense. Finally, just to go back to Tatura, life for the parents was very difficult, but we kids enjoyed ourselves enormously, and particularly on this day, when we were given a huge dollop of vitamin C by way of oranges. It's the Orange Day, and you'll see that Eva Duldig at the front here with her orange, and I'm around there somewhere, it doesn't matter. Thank you very much.
Ruth Gottlieb arrived in Sydney when she was 3 with her Austrian parents, Otto and Hannah Gottlieb. Otto, a civil and industrial engineer, had been employed in Malaya for nearly 18 months. The family were in the process of gaining British citizenship, but it did not come through in time to prevent their internment. Her brother Ronnie was born in an army hospital in Tatura. In Australia, her father worked for Hume Pipes Limited in managerial positions.
I'm going to start my story of the Queen Mary back in 1926, which is my mother at 18 and my father at 20. and my father was studying at Vienna University. Some years later, this is them sitting on a very cushy wall in a place called San Remo. The next slide takes us all the way from Austria back to Italy. When they went, my father went from Vienna after he married my mother to Italy, where he had received a position as an industrial engineer at a small artisan chocolate factory, and he worked there until 1938, and when Mussolini's laws asked the Jewish foreigners to be removed, and he went back to Austria. After a short internment in Dachau, he left Austria to go to Malaya. Well, he didn't know he was going to Malaya. He was on a ship to Shanghai, and in Singapore it stopped. And a representative from a British mining company got on board and asked for an engineer, a cook, a baker, and an accountant. Now, I think Ronnie Fichtdor's grandfather was the accountant, and my father was the engineer. And he got off in Singapore, but never stayed there. He was straight away sent all over Malaya, working in tin mines, working on roads and pipelines and all the infrastructure that was necessary for tin mines to sustain them. This really was a workhorse, the elephant. And the next picture shows a bit of the workforce, which was interestingly not Malays. It was mostly Indians and the Hakka Chinese, and a lot of those were women. We were then moved to Singapore by a very polite letter asking us to present as enemy aliens and that we would be transferred on the Queen Mary. We went on the Queen Mary and landed in Sydney. I don't remember the voyage particularly well. I do remember the train, and I remember not being able to look out of the window. When we got to Tatura, as far as a child was concerned, I didn't have an unpleasant laugh. As George said, we kids had a good time. And I don't think I ever asked my parents were they frightened or sorry. I was aware there were sadnesses, but I wasn't sure what they were. I was lucky enough to be invited, I think, to the only wedding that took place in Tatura, which was Lotte Cullum, who had been a Singapore resident, and Hans Fischer, who also had been a Singapore resident. And they became very good friends, and we shared a flat with them many years later in St Kilda. This wedding, I don't remember terribly clearly. I do remember it was pretty special. From the internment camp, a group of the men realised that they could probably leave the camp if they joined the Australian Army. And I think this little group, of which my father is in the white shorts in the middle, and Gerhard Seefeld, as the leader of the camp, was in front of him. That small group became part of, I think, the 8th Employment Company, which I think I'm right in saying became a labour force for the Australian Army. They moved potatoes and unloaded stuff, a lot in Tokemwal on the border area. My father stayed in the army, and I think because of his linguistic skills, he moved around all the prisoner of war camps, translating in Italian and German. And while he was there, he made me a pram, which was made, well, the pram is now in the Tatura Gallery, and we're not sure who the painter is, but we're all trying to find out. My parents ended up settling in St Kilda and lived there fairly happily. My father went on working as an industrial and civil engineer, went back to Singapore working and back to Austria, but lived happily in Australia.
Miriam Gould is another presenter who can't be with us today, so I am going to read out her words on her behalf. Miriam was a senior English teacher and the convener of many students in her 22 years at Mount Scopus Memorial College. Born in Singapore, she travelled with her parents to Australia when she was 11 months old. In 1977, her father, Werner Bayer, was awarded an MBE and the Queen's Jubilee Medal for services to Australian music. Her mother, Ilse Blair,
was a balaclava, Melbourne suburb, identity until her death at 101 in 2019. Born in 1914 in Berlin, Werner Bayer was a promising young pianist who had studied under Schnabel and dreamed of becoming a conductor, a dream that seemed distant as Nazi power in Germany increased. His wife Ilse, shown here with her father Nathan Presch and brother Karl Heinz, was an outstanding student who had also seen her dream of becoming a journalist disappear. She had endured a dressmaking apprenticeship so that she would, as her father insisted, have a profession not dependent on language that she could take to other lands. On that most infamous of nights, Kristallnacht, November 1938, Werner was taken to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Ilse, in desperation, was able to secure 2 tickets to Shanghai, the only place that would take Jews. She went to the commandant and, with these in hand, was able to secure Werner's release. The form on the screen is the release form for Jude Werner Bayer, or in translation, Jew Werner Bayer. Ilse and Werner on the Potsdam, sailing from Genoa. En route, they heard of a music position in Singapore, teaching and playing the organ. So, as fate would have it, they disembarked in Singapore. The young Bayers loved the cosmopolitan atmosphere of this British colony, although they feared desperately for the family left in Germany. They were overjoyed when their daughter, Miriam, was born in October 1939. Werner was busy with organ and piano recitals as well as teaching. Ilse had worked at a dressmaker's salon, but was let go when the British clientele refused to be fitted by a German. This is a thank you letter for a concert Werner gave. Their lives were to change again. The British, as the war became more deadly, were fearful of a fifth column. Germans, Austrians and Italians, including the Bayer family, were directed to the Queen Mary, and these so-called enemy aliens were taken to Australia. They were termed prisoners of war, and the form stated, captured in Singapore. Very different from the Dunera, the life aboard ship was pleasant, and the concern was how much to tip the crew. Internment at Tatura. Although the barbed wire was reminiscent of other terrifying camps, conditions were generally good, and the soldiers guarding the camp were obliging and pleasant. However, for Ilse, the fears for her loved ones overseas were overwhelming. All communication to Tatura was opened and censored. Ilse learnt of the death of her mother in Brazil and spiraled into grief. Her health was so affected that the authorities decided she should be given an egg every day. Bear in mind that in late 1940, the Nazi forces seemed all-powerful, and it was by no means certain that the Allies would triumph. Only the words of Winston Churchill, "We will never surrender," gave her hope. In 1942, Werner joined the 8th Employment Company under the revered Captain Broughton. Knowing Werner's musical ability, Broughton gave him latrine duty so he would have the rest of the day to practice and also to protect his pianist hands from hard labour. Ilse was allowed, with Miriam, to get rooms in St Kilda, so long as she reported to the police every week. This is a photo of the Bayer family in 1942. Werner and Miriam in army days. Werner was to win a national ABC song competition under the pseudonym John Werner. When the war ended, both Ilse and Werner were anxious to be naturalized, as they knew their future was in this new country. The marriage did not endure, but both were to remarry happily. This is a photo of Werner taken by Max Dupain in 1947. He was to fulfill his musical promise in Sydney, working with the ABC and the Australian Opera, as well as composing a number of liturgical works. He was also choir master at the Great Synagogue and Temple Emmanuel for many years. In 1977, Werner was appointed an MBE, and he was also awarded a Queen's Jubilee Medal for services to Australian music. The adjacent photo shows Werner with Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Ilse led an interesting and cultured life. She worked in her shop, Ilse Blair Exclusive Gowns, at 204 Carlisle Street, Balaclava, for many years. In later life, she delighted in her large family. This photograph, taken in 2019, shows Ilse, fourth left from top, surrounded by family at the Seder table, Pesach 2019. An amazing journey. Ilse and Werner are two more examples of Queen Mary internees who, buffeted by fate, managed to triumph over their circumstances and build a new and rewarding life in Australia.
Eva de Jong Duldig. Eva was born in Vienna 1 month before the Anschluss and arrived in Australia when she was 2. Hitting her first tennis balls on the court her father built in Tatura, she became a quarter-finalist at Wimbledon, and after her marriage to Henry de Jong, was champion of the Netherlands. Her award-winning family memoir, Driftwood, Escape and Survival Through Art, was published in 2017. Eva.
Our arrival in Australia took place only a few days before the Jewish New Year, which in 1940 on the screen is an image of my mother, Slava Horowitz Duldig, which came from the Australian archives. I can't imagine her feelings when she had to put on a numbered vest, a prisoner's number. The loss of freedom really weighed much more heavily even than that on my father, Karl Duldig. The inscription on the left, as you can see, says Przemysl 1902, and on the right, Tatura 1941. Did he think that was going to be the end of his life? After a year in internment, nobody at the camp knew how long we would still be incarcerated. The mood in the camp was down as all the petitions for release had failed, and news of the war, when it did filter through to the internees, was utterly depressing. At that stage, nobody knew that Singapore was about to fall, and that indeed, as has been already mentioned, we were the most fortunate group alive to get out of there in time. The middle drawing is a little sketch Dad did of me, his impression of his little daughter. Next slide shows two families outside the huts in which we were living. On the right are Miriam, Ilse, and Werner Bear. Miriam owned this photo to us, so thank you to Miriam. She's just a little bit younger than I am, and she's watching, I hope, today. And on the left is a photo of me with my mum and dad outside our luxury dwelling in Tatura. You can also see just a slight image of detail of the sculpture that my father carved there with an axe, and it was standing around for all of us to play. And the next slide actually shows you it in raw detail. There it is, my father's drawing, and the children are all of us little tots running around playing Ring-a-Ring-a-Rosie and having a really good time, as George already mentioned, and Ruth and I would agree that all the children really had nothing to worry about. We could wander freely through the camp. We had our parents near us, and we had lots and lots of playmates. But for the parents, it was another story. Every one of my father's drawings in the camp shows the barbed wire. On the right is a carving he did from a fragment, and he called it fragment, a fragment that is a piece of firewood. And that particular sculpture survived, and it is in the Newcastle Gallery, whereas the large sculpture you see in the drawing was chopped up by the next inmates for firewood. And here we are in Melbourne. We're free. I think we look free. I think we look happy. I always thought my father looked so handsome in his uniform and with his digger's hat, and my mother in her smart Viennese costume, she would have said, and her hat, which she kept wearing till it was absolutely threadbare, making sure that I was always beautifully clad. The sacrifices were great, but in the end, as we all know, we actually have been extraordinarily lucky. And it is that luck which has taken us forward in this country.